It's the Blue Collar Breakdown! Welcome to the Blue Collar Breakdown! Starting right now!
Hello, welcome to the Blue Collar Breakdown, episode number 17. Today we're going to talk about what would a good tariff look like. Of course, there is no such thing as a good tariff, but let's say the least harmful tariff. Before I do that, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to tell you that I had an article published at the Libertarian Institute this morning. Today, Wednesday, October, 8th? And you can go see that. It's on immigration and the culture war, or the culture argument. Gee, do immigrants destroy the culture? Do they? I don't cover the criminality because I published that a couple of weeks ago, but do they bring less religion, more less understanding of America's culture of freedom than compared to, say, immigrants a century ago? Do they become net tax takers as opposed to net tax payers? All of those issues covered in pretty much in depth in that article. So definitely go to the Libertarian Institute, their website, libertarianinstitute.org, and check that out. And also check out all the other great stuff over at the Libertarian Institute. Scott Horton's doing great work over there, and pretty much everything that they publish is a gem. So make sure you do that. Also, I was interviewed on Fountainhead Forum, another podcast on YouTube and other places. So definitely check that out when it comes out. It's not published yet, but it will be soon. So I want to thank Mr. Baker for interviewing me, and I'll be doing other interviews as well. And pretty soon we'll be doing more interviews, I should say, in this podcast. But for today, it's just me. And we're going to talk about what a good tariff would be, or what a least harmful tariff would be. Of course, as a libertarian, my bias is, well, we shouldn't have any taxes. And a tariff is a tax. It's a tax on import. Under the Constitution, they would have called it a duty rather than a tax, but it's the same basic thing. And that doesn't mean, however, even though I'm libertarian, doesn't mean I'm reflexively tariff bad, no tariff good. It depends. I'm an economist, so I have to say it depends, right? It's the old joke about the one-armed economist. Lyndon Johnson, when he was president, said to one of his aides, "Can someone find me a one-armed economist?" And they said, "Mr. President, what do you mean? Why do you need a one-armed economist?" He said, "Because they're always saying on the one hand and then on the other hand." But the real question in economics is not what is the ideal, but compared to what? And in this case, tariffs can be, not necessarily are, but can be the least intrusive tax. So let's talk a little bit about that. And we could go into sort of the history of it as well. But before I get into that, the history of the tax and how might it be made less damaging to the economy than, say, another tax. And eventually we're going to cover the legality of the issue, and it's going through the court system right now. So we'll talk about the constitutional issues as well, because I have an interest in that as well. But before I do, I want to cover one of the topics that it seems to be a perpetual issue with anyone that backs tariffs. And the line is, if you don't, how do they put it? If you don't want to pay the tariff, then don't buy imported goods, and then you don't pay the tax. And that, while that's technically true because you don't actually pay the tax, that's like saying, well, I don't pay the sales tax when I buy stuff at the store. I mean, I don't know, that yes, the merchant collects the tax and sends it to the government, right? We don't actually send it to the government. But as a practical matter, there's no way to avoid when tariffs, especially when they're so common, but even when they're not common, it's almost impossible not to buy a foreign good. In a $20 trillion economy where $3 trillion are imported goods, it's really hard to buy something that isn't at least partly imported, because a lot of goods have many components, and some of them are imported and some of them are not. Case in point, this was a story about a month ago. Back in July, a couple months back, Procter & Gamble to increase U.S. prices. They announced they were going to increase prices by $1 billion because of tariffs. That means all the products went up about 5% just because of tariffs, in addition to all the inflation. So, and Procter & Gamble makes stuff in America. I'm not a big fan of the company, but they make stuff in America. But one of the things is a lot of the raw materials that they use have been tariffed. So they're manufacturing in America, and they are at risk of being less competitive internationally, because if their raw materials are bought here and they're taxed, and it costs them more to get raw materials than, say, a manufacturer in Mexico or in Canada or in the European Union, then they're going to be at a competitive disadvantage. Okay. But my point here is you could buy US goods and not realize that you're paying a tariff, even though you're buying US goods, because it has some components that are imported goods. Or even you could buy a straight up imported good and not realize it. Let's take, for example, sugar. All right. There's a tariff on sugar. Actually, there's been a tariff on sugar for a long time, but it got increased under the Trump administration. The United States has long had sugar prices that are about double the global average. All right. We pay about twice as much per pound for sugar. You go to the grocery store, you buy your bag of Diamond or your generic, and you pay twice as much as someone in Ethiopia or Canada or Norway or Guatemala, okay, because of the tariffs that are put on foreign imports of sugar. They want to protect sugar makers in sugar growers in Hawaii, in Louisiana, and Mississippi, and as a result, we pay more. So, but my point is this: how do you avoid paying more? And how do you know that whether or not you're buying American sugar or imported sugar? Because some is grown here, some is grown elsewhere. How do you know? I mean, the line, well, you don't have to pay the tariff. All you have to do is buy American. How do you know you're buying American? For example, Domino Sugar. They import sugar, but they refine it here in America. Is that American or foreign? Well, it's a little of both, isn't it? But you don't really know. Typically, they could put on their labels, "Hey, manufactured right in here in the United States," and you wouldn't know on the label. They were, that the sugar cane plants they're grown on and were in Venezuela or in Cuba, or where, not in Cuba, but somewhere else on the planet, and you wouldn't know. So the argument, oh, well, you just buy American, you don't have to pay the tariff. And of course, and then there's other things, like you just flat out can't buy American grown mangoes or coffee, or, like you could buy Hawaiian Kona, but I mean that, for the most part, many of these products are only imported just because of the climate, or because in the case of titanium, it's you import titanium. If you tariff it, there's not going to be American manufactured. We don't have that much titanium. And what happens if you import it? Well, then all the airplanes being made by Boeing and all the other aircraft manufacturing companies that use titanium, they're going to have to increase their prices. They become competitively disadvantaged compared to Russian-made planes, European-made planes like Airbus, all of the others, and we end up selling more. The United States imports $3 trillion worth of goods, but we also export $2 trillion worth of goods. So if the tariffs on imported goods of raw materials ends up costing American manufacturers exports, then we lose jobs on net, and that's the real risk. Okay, so let me just do a 30-second history. When America was created, one of the first bills that Congress passed was a tariff bill. It was actually the fourth bill passed after a couple of setting up the Treasury Department and setting up oaths of office and stuff like that. And it was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton wanted a protectionist tariff. And by protectionist, he means I want to competitively disadvantage foreign importers to American manufacturers. All right. Jefferson and Madison had a different view. They wanted a tariff too, but they wanted it to be what they called a revenue tariff. Let's just raise the tariff high enough to where it raises the money we need for the government. Let's not worry about protecting American industries because that would just cost American consumers more and create corruption. Okay. What are the advantages of protectionism? And there are advantages. A libertarian saying that there are no advantages is a libertarian who's not really telling you the whole truth or thinking it through. All right. A well-ordered protectionism will increase the amount of manufactured goods in the United States, for sure. And that will, in many instances, create more jobs. And the jobs may be higher pay. Well, almost certainly will be higher paying. But the problem is the purchasing power of those higher paying jobs will be diminished because the consumer will pay more for the goods that are made. So it's sort of a wash there. All right. Now, traditionally, Alexander Hamilton and the protectionists in America, going from Hamilton through, if you remember your American history class in high school, Henry Clay, who was a big protectionist, to William McKinley, who was president and authored this huge tariff bill in the early 2000s, late 1890s and early 2000s, and up to Smoot-Hawley. What they wanted to do was put a tax on manufactured finished goods, not on raw materials. All right, that was the idea behind it, because they wanted Americans to make stuff for Americans, but they also wanted to be able to export materials. And the problem is, if you tax the raw materials, you raise the cost of production, and now American goods become unaffordable internationally. So traditionally, if you will, a good protectionist would say, no, what we want is a very low tax on imports if they're raw materials, but a high tax on finished goods that is almost prohibitive, to where how much money you raise for the government is almost secondary. You almost don't want the government to raise money because you want to prohibit goods from coming into the United States that we can make ourselves. Okay, that's the protections. Now, the revenue tariff guys like Jefferson and Madison, I kind of put myself in this category, is, okay, if we have to have a tax, well, what's the least intrusive tax? What's the tax that bothers American citizens in their daily lives the least? And you have to think, well, gee, on an income tax, I have to fill out this form every April 15th, and I have to go through all of this procedure. And even with the sales tax, it bothers businesses. They have to file all these forms, and you could go through almost every tax. But a tariff, unless you're in the business of importing or exporting, you are not bothered by the tax collector because it's already collected at the border. Inside the United States, there's no tax collector. I mean, traditionally, now, of course, you could you could fly in goods and there would be an impost. But traditionally, they would sail in, and you would literally, the tax collector would be banished to 1 mile from the coast of the United States. So Jefferson bragged about this in his first, or I should say, his second inaugural address. He said, "Hey, we abolished all the taxes at the national level, and all we have is one low tariff, and no American ever sees a tax collector of the United States unless he's in the business of importing goods." Okay. But the revenue tariff also would focus on taxing finished goods, not on raw materials. A good revenue tariff would be one where the finished goods are taxed, not the raw materials, because you don't want to make American business uncompetitive. All right. So they sort of agree on that aspect of it. Now we can look by contrast at Donald Trump's tariffs that he announced unilaterally without Congress, and take a look at, okay, well, how do they stack up compared to these historical tariffs that Congress has enacted? And Congress, one of the things that I learned back in my days when I was the research guy for the John Birch Society, I used to go to Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and I'd read old congressional records. And it was fascinating for me, because I'm a dork, reading all the old tariff debates in Congress back in the 1870s and the early 1900s and in the 1840s, the 30s, under the Tariff of Abominations. And one of the things that the congressmen kind of prided themselves on was the ability, I think maybe they overestimated their ability, but the ability to look at the different markets and judge how much each item should be taxed to maximize the tax or to maximize a protection. And there's not a lot of that going on with the Trump administration. In fact, there's none of it going on. What happens is Trump tweets out, "I'm going to levy a tax on this. China is destroying us. I'm going to put a tax on China. I'm going to do universal tariffs on everybody." And they're across the board tariffs. They go from 10% up to, I think it was some African country, Botswana, or some country where we imported diamonds from them and they didn't buy anything from us. And the tariff went up to, I think, 90%. And it was because the tariffs were based upon our trade ratio, not on the foreign government's policies toward the United States. So, and then that's important when it comes later, when we talk about the constitutional and the legal path through the courts, that Trump's tariffs don't relate directly to what the other countries are charging us or their discriminatory policies, only what our bilateral trade relationship is. I mean, it's very likely, like in the case of Botswana, we buy diamonds from Botswana. I forget if it was Botswana. It might have been Eswatini or some fairly sparsely populated Southern African country that was famous for diamonds. We buy diamonds from them. They don't buy anything from us. But what happens often is this: we buy diamonds from them, and then we sell something to Angola or whatever, and Angola sells to Eswatini or Botswana, and the trade circuit is completed without this sort of perpetual deficit of dollars going overseas. Okay. But anyway, the Trump tariffs don't relate to that. They're just sort of, here are the tariff rates, and they're the same for raw materials and they're the same for finished goods. And what is happening is, in many instances, we're losing our competitive edge because of Trump's tariffs. It is one of the worst ways to do a tariff, the way Trump is doing it. All right. And there's not a lot of thought involved in these tariffs. And you could sort of tell just by the way Trump announces in the middle of the night, "I'm going to tariff this country," and on a Truth Social post, as there's sort of this hodgepodge of I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that. So, in my opinion, it's hurting the economy, and there are all kinds of stories that I could point to, where even, for example, like if you tariff steel imports, you might think, oh, well, that's good. We should make more American steel. Until you realize, well, wait a minute. There's a lot of cars made out of steel, and there's a lot of dishwashers and washers and dryers made out of steel in America. There's a lot of power tools made out of steel. There's a lot of buildings made out of steel, because if you use any sort of a concrete building, you would reinforce it with steel, with the rebar steel. And in Massachusetts, there's a huge plant that just went out of business because they couldn't afford to be competitive, and as a result of the tariffs, that it was the steel that caused them to go out of business. So, in my opinion, it's economically it's bad. But if you were to do a tariff, in my opinion, you should do a revenue tariff, not a protectionist tariff. But if you were to do a protectionist tariff, even then, you would not tax raw materials. You would only tax the finished goods with the idea of keeping manufacturing in the United States. And it would still harm the economy, and it would still cost American taxpayers at the grocery store, at the auto dealership, at all of these, but it wouldn't cost as much as it's currently costing. Okay. Now I want to talk, I didn't want to do that. Now I want to talk a little bit about the legal aspects of this. So, for example, does President Trump have the power to just raise tariffs? I was raised on Schoolhouse Rock, and one of the things I learned is that, Congress raises taxes. And if you read Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution, it says all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, and then the Senate, and then it goes on and says the president can veto it, whatever. But the idea is Congress makes the law for raising taxes, all right, raising revenue. Now, obviously, Trump is bragging about all the revenue that these tariffs are creating. Shouldn't that begin in the House of Representatives? And then, of course, Article 1, Section 8 sort of buttresses Congress's power, right? Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. And notice I highlighted duties, because an import tax is a duty in the old style of speak. It's not technically a tax. A tax would be more of an internal tax, a tax inside the United States, whether it's or it might even be called an impost. But either way, basically, Congress is given the power to do all of the taxes. And I note also here, a little bit further down in Article 1, Section 8, it says Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, not the president. Okay, that's kind of important, that it's not President Trump that has that power, but Congress that has that power. Now, President Trump is the only one to have ever raised the tariff without Congress. Just last year, President Biden, he put up a tariff on, $8 billion worth of Chinese goods? I can't read the small print here. Maybe it was 13. I think it's in the text here. $18 billion worth of Chinese goods, he increased the tariff on them, okay? Because he says China was being unfair. So he's not the first one, but Trump is sort of the first one to do it across the board, and to do it with such frequency. And of course, in this case, President Biden had a specific beef about Chinese trade policies, whereas President Trump is talking, especially when he was talking about when he announced the broad global tariff system back in April, he wasn't complaining about a particular trade policy for a particular country. He was simply talking about the balance of trade with that particular country, which may or may not even be a problem. Okay, so we've got that. Now, one of the cases that President Trump makes is, hey, we've got these laws that Congress passed that basically say this is the International Emergency Economic, what is it called? Powers Act. Okay, so it's the IEEPA, and it was passed in 1977. It's probably the most recent law that President Trump referenced in his brief before the United States Supreme Court, because the case to declare these tariffs unconstitutional is going before the Supreme Court. I'm going to talk about the court case in a minute, but here's President Trump's legal standing from the law that he's claiming. Okay, and he says, and if you just read along with me, if you're watching, if you're not, I'll read it for you. If you're just listening, any authority granted the president may be exercised to deal with, and here's the key phrase, any unusual and an extraordinary threat which has as its source, in whole or in substantial part outside the United States, to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such a threat. So the essence of the problem here is with Trump's across-the-board thing is it has to be an extraordinary threat. It can't be sort of an ongoing, here's the thing, because if it were just an ongoing problem with taxes, with tariffs or trade, then Congress could simply do it themselves. Congress could simply say, hey, we'll pass a law. We could get around to it. We could do it this spring, or we could do it in the fall. There's nothing that's an extraordinary threat to our national security or to our economy in the next couple of months that Congress can't get to. So I think the IEEPA is probably not going to stand up in court. The other law he cites in his case, and there's a couple others that are predecessors to this, but this is the Trade Act of 1974, and it says the president can take action to raise a tariff or lower a tariff. And it says here, any action taken under paragraph 1 to eliminate an act, policy, or practice shall be devised so as to affect goods or services of the foreign country in an amount that is equivalent in value to the burden or restriction being imposed by that country on United States commerce. And again, trying to draw the distinction between, hey, does Eswatini really put a 60% burden on us because we buy a lot of their diamonds? I mean, I don't think that's going to hold up either. And President Trump's brief before the Supreme Court, let me go to before that to the appellate court decision. The appellate court ruled 8-4. It was a group of judges who are basically circuit court judges who are also approved to rule in the appellate court. And they ruled this way. They said, and it's the highlighted part at the bottom here, Congress alone has access to the pockets of the people, again, citing Federalist 48 by James Madison. Accordingly, we would also affirm, because Congress did not unambiguously delegate its taxing power to the president in IEEPA. Okay, so the district court or the circuit court ruled against the Trump administration. Now the appellate court has ruled against the Trump administration by 8-4, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And before I even get to the Trump's thing, I want to talk a little bit about delegating powers from Congress to the president. There's precedent for the Supreme Court declaring that unconstitutional. I mean, it goes back a ways, but if you go back to 1935, there was a case called the ALA Schechter Poultry Company Incorporated versus U.S., and it went to the Supreme Court. It was called the chicken picking case, and basically, it's kind of a fun story. The National Recovery Administration, or the National Recovery Administration Act, NARA, was basically said, hey, we've got to set a price for chickens. We've got to set a uniform price across the country for chickens because we want to be able to control prices. And what they did was they said, okay, well, we have a problem because some chickens are big and fat and some chickens are skinny and sickly, and some are worth more than others. So what we're going to do is we're going to say you can only sell them by the 100 lot. I forget whether it was 100 or 50 or whatever it was. But ALA Schechter Poultry Company said, no, we want our customers to be able to pick their chickens, not just put them in a basket. And besides, we think this whole thing is unconstitutional because Congress didn't authorize the setting of prices for chickens or any of this other stuff under the what was then the NRA, National Recovery Administration. So it went to the Supreme Court, and by 9-0, the liberals in the court and the conservatives both agreed that, and you can read along with me here, that the act was the NRA, then NARA, the National Authorization Recovery Act, was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. The president cannot be allowed to have unbridled control to make whatever law he believes to be necessary to achieve a certain goal. The law did not establish rules or standards to evaluate industrial activity, meaning Congress failed to provide the necessary guidelines for the implementation of this functionally legislative process. And they declared the whole act unconstitutional. And that was the end of the New Deal one. Roosevelt had to basically start over. I think that's what's going to happen in this case as well. I think we're looking at, if not a 9-0 case, at least a 7-2. I think what's going to happen is, again, probably 9-0. All of the Democratic justices are going to come out against Trump's tariffs, and all of Trump's 3 justices are going to come out against Trump's tariffs. And I think the only wobbly ones will be the 2 Bush appointees. I think you're going to have maybe Roberts and Alito be the wobbly ones who may try to justify continuing the tariffs. But even they probably will write some sort of a concurring opinion saying, nah, these have to go. All right. And it's kind of a little bit scary when I look at the brief. All right. Here's the Trump administration's brief. So his Solicitor General sent this up to the Supreme Court, and the stridency in it and how do I put this? The apparent willingness to go against court rulings is pretty endemic in it. This is a very serious challenge to the legitimacy of courts. Can the president just ignore the courts? Because at the top here, it said, the top highlighted part says, the argument that Congress vests the power to regulate trade and to impose taxes in Congress is no answer, as Article 1, Section 8 vests all the legislative powers of the federal government in Congress. But that does not mean that Congress cannot delegate those powers to the presidency. And of course, I go back to ALA Schechter versus U.S. I think there's a decent chance that some some member of the Supreme Court will remember that case because this is not a blanket. None of these laws were blanket authority for the president to do whatever he wants on tariffs. All right. But here's the scary part, the second highlighted part. Whether a judge or a plaintiff diagnoses with the precise manner in which Trump is using the power does not diminish in the slightest the fact that he is exercising a power properly designated to him by Congress. Okay. Whether a judge says that, is he going to ignore the judges? I don't know. I mean, if the Supreme Court goes after him and says, I think it will be important for the Supreme Court to go 9-0. But either way, even if it's 7-2, and all of Trump's appointees, now that Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, and Neil Gorsuch, if those 3 end up in a 7-2, I think that's enough of a rebuff against Trump, because I can't picture him saying, "What idiot appointed these 3 judges?" I mean, maybe he would say that. I don't know, but those are Trump-appointed judges, and I think my good money, I'd bet Benjamins to donuts that those 3 will come out and strike these tariffs down. And then the question becomes, at the very end here, I'm winding up the program. Once the tariffs are declared unconstitutional, then what happens? Well, the tariffs go back down to zero. But then the question is, if they're an unconstitutional tax, can those tariffs be rebated to the importers? And I think the answer is yes. I think a lot of importers will get a rebate for all of the tariffs that have been paid. And that's hundreds of billions of dollars over the time period that these tariffs will have been in place by the time the Supreme Court rules. They're having oral arguments on November 5th, so less than a month away, and they will decide probably before next summer. It wouldn't surprise me if they decided early spring, because I think this is a pretty clear-cut case. I think that the Trump tariffs will go down, and not because they're bad policy, which they are, but because they're pretty blatantly unconstitutional. I mean, if the president can just say, hey, some law gives me the vague ability to do something, and then he can do anything he wants, I think that's a dangerous precedent when a Democrat gets in and there's some sort of wiggle room in income taxes or some other tax that Americans on the right really don't want. So I think the right thing's going to happen eventually, but it's going to take some time because the Supreme Court has to rule, and then there's going to be some political shakedown, and there'll be economic shakedown as well. I mean, there's an economic shakedown in the form of our exports becoming less competitive internationally. There are businesses that are closing. Consumers are paying a higher price, not just for foreign goods that we have to import, like coffee and bananas and mangoes and all of those things, but for finished goods that are now more expensive because many of the raw materials are being tariffed because of imports. So I think this will hurt our economy. I don't know if we'll go into recession because of it. It will definitely take a few ticks off of our GDP. Whether that's enough to send the U.S. economy into recession is hard to say, because there's so many things going on in a huge economy like the United States, and a lot has to go wrong for us to go into recession. But this is one of the things that is going wrong, and it will tilt us toward recession. But whether it's enough by itself to bring us into recession, I think not. But there's other things that are going wrong too that could bring us there. So who knows? Okay, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the program. Please like, please subscribe, please share with your friends, and please tune in next week for Blue Collar Breakdown.